This is Sonic Ventures, a podcast celebrating the concept album format with Robert Goebel and Joël Tibbetts.
Sonic Ventures is an evolving series of discussions that explore concept albums from a variety of artists and genres. Our intent here is to have celebratory conversations of our personal experiences with selected works and the issues and themes surrounding concept albums.
Sometimes, we will be treading familiar waters concerning music interpretation and creation. Other times, we will venture into different places of thought, emotion, and expression. We invite you to join us on our sonic venture.
Rob here. Welcome to this conversation, which is actually our Episode 1 conversation of Sonic Ventures. Not our very first conversation, but one of the first, recorded August 27th, 2021. One of the exciting things for me when I think about this conversation in particular is that we had held off on having any conversations until we could get hot on the mics. So what you're hearing here is really one of the first times that we've been able to sit down and actually talk about music and talk about our experiences with concept albums, because we had been deferring until we could get set up to do this. So what you hear is the sort of freshness and newness of the endeavor. You can hear us both sort of struggling for and looking for language to sort of create that common vocabulary through which we're going to share our observations and our feelings and our thoughts. Really, we're creating a discourse here, a personal discourse that's both a friendship, but it's also one that's going to allow us to explore the whole theme of the podcast, which is concept albums. Because of the sort of freshness of this and the newness of this in our conversation cycles, we are working with the mics and the technology in real time here. And you can hear the plosives and the different audio elements that sort of creep into the conversational mix as we try and navigate technology while still sort of keeping the kitchen table aesthetic that was really the sort of mythos, or not the mythos, but the ethos, which hopefully will become the mythos of the conversation. So, the idea, two people sitting at a kitchen table, having a conversation and just sort of sharing and building, sort of ideas and thoughts and friendships and through music and through conversation. If you listen really hard, I think you could probably hear one of the neighbors mowing a lawn, the odd siren or airplane, lots of different things going on here. But really, I remember it quite fondly because it was great to listen to, some of the early experiences that Joël had with concept albums. And it was neat to sort of dig into my own memory and sort of unfold my own of the same. So I hope you enjoy it, and I certainly did, and we look forward to doing many more.
Okay, we're rolling.
There we go. Now, I know in our last conversation, I think you started off with the question.
I did.
So I think on this one, I think the question to start off with, what's your first awareness of or first exposure to a concept album or the idea of a concept album? Like how, if you go back in your mind, where does that come to fruition for you?
It's burned in my memory as a stellar moment.
Yeah.
So I was 15.
Yeah.
And at that point, my musical palette was a mixture of things, classical, jazz, rock, but I was very much in the rock mindset, playing guitar, and I was heavy Van Halen fan. and a lot of the other guitar gods at that time. And it'd been early into me meeting a friend of mine. He came to the school, and he's a bass player. And he had a friend who was a drummer. And so we got talking and that. And early on in us getting to know each other, I went over to his house, which is just a few blocks from, was just a few blocks from here. And he said, "You have to listen to this." It was, "You don't know this? You have to listen to it." And I'll never forget, we're in his kitchen, and he goes into the living room, and he puts this thing on, and it starts going. And as it goes, it gets the hook in me deeper and deeper and deeper. And I can't believe what I'm listening to. I'd never heard anyone do this with rock music, ever. And when it was done, I was a total devotee of the band and the genre of a concept album. And the ironic thing is, it was only one side. It was Rush 2112. And I'll never forget sitting in his kitchen with my mouth hanging open the whole time. Because at that point, I had something of a relationship with orchestral music, symphonic music, which was the place where I heard long pieces of music, very clearly orchestrated and composed and on a large scale. But to hear basically 3 instruments and a vocal take me to the same degrees and qualities as a symphonic endeavor blew my mind. And I immediately went out and bought that album and a handful of other Rush albums. But that was the first album where I had encountered a concept album, and I got it. So for sure, before that, I had heard elements of other concept albums, right? As Pink Floyd,
Sure.
for example. But to really have the moment of hearing it and recognizing that this is what a concept album is in the rock genre, because for the most part, I think concept albums have been, I don't want to say carried along, but the banner of the concept album has really shown up probably the most in rock music, progressive music too. So that was my first experience, was that album. And I even remember the smell of the kitchen.
Wow.
Yeah, I remember
Was it
that.
vinyl? Was it cassette? What was it?
Oh, it was an album. It was vinyl.
Oh, wow.
It was vinyl. Yeah.
Now, was I can't remember, but were lyrics included on the insert, on the sleeve?
I sat there in the kitchen naked with nothing to hold on to.
No, just
There was no lyrics to it. He said, "Just listen to this."
wow.
So my first inclination was, and I think it still is vocals kind of come in second.
Yeah.
I listen to the instrument, what the instruments are doing, and the engineering, and the vocals are coming. I'm not like that as much as I was when I was younger. When I was younger, vocals were always secondary. But for me, it was just that opening overture, and I understood the format because I had some of that experience with orchestral music, where things are introduced and they're going to come up later. This isn't just one song after another. This is very intentional. This is going to happen later, and this is going to happen later, and we've just compressed all of it into this nice little gem. And I remember the second, I guess the deeper aspect to that was then within days we were just woodshedding that. I was like, okay, fine, you played it for me, you better deliver. And fortunately, this person's bass playing was just like Geddy Lee's, and he was 15 years old.
Right.
The drummer we were with at the time was not there, but soon after we did find someone who was able to play very much like Pert. And I was the one who introduced him to Rush. So there was this weird kind of passing the torch, as it were. But the first album was 2112, and then for about 5 or 6 years, it was a staple thing that I would play, that we would play, is 2112, the whole thing from cover, from the first side, that one side.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
How did you remember talking about the concept? What, or was it the experience of it? It's sort of, did it that exist for you without language? Like, was listening to that an experience, or like, what's the relationship there between what you listened to and how you experienced it in the kitchen, and the actual sort of through line of the concept?
Oh, right. Well, the experience in the kitchen was just like the first time you ever jump into a lake and it's cold. My whole self was electrified. And that's why I remember it. Because there was nothing hanging around me saying, don't listen to this. Don't get in. It was everything about, where was this? I'm so glad it's come to me. Like, it was love, really. It was a feeling of love. So that stayed, and it's still with me. It's right here with me now in this room. Like, I love talking about that experience. The concept in the album came, I started to delve into that progressively more and more. And I remember it was because in the concept, the main character finds a guitar in a cave,
Yeah.
and the whole tuning of that guitar and the intimacy of that, and the mythological sonic experience of, you hear the water in the cave, right? They did all that to put you there. That was very important to me, because the whole theme that comes up in 2112, which is a very simple one, is that you can't do that. We don't need that anymore. This is not what we have in this kind of world, which I believe was personified to be one of a kind of rationality,
Yeah.
and a logical way of looking at life and living, and that this no longer serves a purpose for humanity. And then this character gives his life for that understanding, right? And even now, as I'm thinking about it, that moment when Life's in Solo comes in with that really hot distortion, and he's just now, like, it was so well interwoven into the content. So I think that electrical first experience just stayed with the concept. They never came separate, but the concept itself, I remember for a number of years I really believed in it, because I actually felt I was living it,
Okay.
because nobody wanted to listen to us play 2112. So here I am. I'm every day when I go into my room, I'm in that cave.
Right.
I've found this instrument, or it's found me, and it responds to me, and I respond to it. And the intimacy of that, I think I felt like, even now when I look upon it, I was living that. And I think very quickly that messaging came with the music, and I never shared that with anyone else. I
Wow.
guess this is the first time I'm saying this to anybody.
Wow.
But when I was that age and I was doing those things, there was also certain music that I just didn't talk about with certain musicians. You know, like, it was like when we were working on originals at one point, I said, it'd be really great to have a woodwind section here. Joel, what are you talking about? We don't have that. Come on, be practical, or. And I was like, well, why can't we think out of the box? And so, like, I think that there was something also in the concept about partially that suppressive or repressive external elements, but also keep going. Even though at the end of that whole journey of that side of that album is the voice of we have assumed control. We have assumed it's very big and domineering.
Right.
I don't believe it. Like it's there. I'm like, no, it's not true. So it's just a very interesting thing about that being the first, if you will, concept album I engaged with. But I also felt like there were parts of me I was living it, that relationship that was really my own in the face of everything else that's going on around you. And the amazing part is that when I ended up at university, I was studying music composition. I heard many times people talk about you don't pull over with your creative life. Everything that's here for you to listen to, these people, they've been prisoners, they've been persecuted, they've had to run from wars, they've had to fight to get their music performed, they've had to fight to get it, like all these things about resilience and perseverance. And I think that was the thing about the concept that really stuck with me. And the music, I think, personifies it incredibly well.
Yeah, it's a very, very well orchestrated story, narrative, experience, that for especially I think for young people, so accessibly identifiable because I got to imagine it's not just musicians listening to 2112.
Right.
Although a lot of people that listened became or aspired to be,
Right.
but it's something about just that sort of general universal theme, and whether the narrative through music, sort of bringing the sort of this sort of spiritual journey and resistance of oppression and
Yeah.
being a quite a universal theme for young people, because whatever it is you're into or whatever it is that you've decided to value, you've got your parents, you've got your school, you've got all these things that
Yeah.
are resisting these things that you're exploring and finding as a young person. So I think that story, incredibly accessible,
Yeah.
and but the fact that it's sort of achieved and told in just such, I want to say perfect sort of presentation musically, like that it makes it even more special that way. Like it definitely has, as I it is, it doesn't feel artificial, even though the conceit or the idea of it could be hacky, like there's just something about the music tied into the lyrics that give it like an earnestness that just really touches young people, I think, in particular, and makes it that much more accessible. And I think that kind of earnestness pre-cynicism, because I think as you if you discover it later on in life, I think your cynicism might prevent entry. Might you might have already walled off that that sort of ability to sort of get carried along through the hope and possibility that's part of that, through the not you don't know from the beginning necessarily that there's the victory isn't there necessarily,
Right.
but you know at the same time the victory was never about winning, but it was more about resisting and expressing, and so
And being.
yeah, and things that maybe young people in the moment need that narrative structure to be able to internalize that journey for themselves, because they're not speaking in philosophical terms necessarily, But so it's this conduit, to bringing them into that arc of that kind of narrative,
Right.
that gives them the through line through the musical presentation. And I'm curious about, when you heard it, how much did you visualize that narrative? Like, how much was a visual experience to you, sort of, and how much of it was sort of more a body based feeling?
That's a great
experience.
question. Well, definitely the whole time was very visceral. Like I said, there was this electric explosion of just rapture, especially that opening overture. It's like, just got me. But it was the use of sound effects that put me in that cave. That was where the real visualization happened. Even now, but I also have this passionate regard for caves and stone-like structures. So that was probably easy, even then, even though I wasn't totally conscious of that about myself at the time. But the sound effects and that moment where, so like up until that point, all the music was composed and was very intentional. And then suddenly there's this moment where someone is actually, you're hearing a vulnerability. So I could see it. I could see this character enter a cave, and I could see what the cave looks like, and that the guitar would be sitting there, and I could see them go to it with hesitance. I could see all of that. And so the music in that moment, the tuning up is not considered to be music, but suddenly it is. It very much is. Tuning is, that's the first guitar frustration. Apart from buying one, is
or not having one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or not having an amp when you have an electric guitar, but is keeping the thing in tune, understanding tuning. It's not like a piano where there you go. There's other instruments, reed instruments, there's some of that there, but really the guitar, for me anyways, that was the first annoyance, was it to be in tune. So the visualization of that vulnerability is highly symbolic, I think, too, of that idea of tuning. Especially, I was 15 years old, emotionally still developing, mentally still developing to a certain degree, and so being in tune. What is that? Because as I was saying before, I felt like I was living this, in a way, living that story of just trying to, no, this is important, and I want to carry on with it. And so the visualization for me was in the cave. And I think a lot of everything else in the story, like I could really see the elders as well as this almost robed, matted gray wall of human intention. Like I could see that too.
So in that sense, did the music serve as the soundtrack to this movie, or this visualization in your head?
Well, I think, it put it there.
Yeah.
So it has to be.
Yeah.
But I think too, because I was so interested, I was so passionate about playing music, I think the visualization was also seeing myself play it.
Right.
And seeing the context. So I was gifted by meeting this person, not only to hear this music and be set upon another kind of vein of a music exploration, but he had a garage that we could play in, and it was a few blocks away, and I had access to it. And so the visualization, I actually pair it with that music as well, is in that garage. I can remember the smell of the garage, and I remember being in there. I remember playing in there in the dead of winter with no heat, and actually wrapping cloth around my hands to keep them warm, because gloves just wouldn't cut it. and I didn't have fingerless gloves, so I would take a scarf and I would like wrap it around my hand just to keep it warm. And I would jump around and we'd move around to warm up. And it was, -5 degrees in there and we were playing. So my visualization with that music was also me playing it. And I think that was actually something I didn't realize that would work against me as I went on a little bit, was seeing myself in ways that weren't, they're so artificial. Some of them no, but some of them they were. And then those are the things that you covet or aim for, but they're not actually what's going on, instead of being surprised by it. But that's another element of visualization. But the visualization of that concept album hinges very much on that cave. And I think also just myself playing it. Like I remember seeing my hands, seeing that space, being in that room with a 20-piece drum set, which our friend eventually got a hold of, and we were able to play the whole thing. And so I think that the visualization of that album is also multi-dimensionally transfixed with the kitchen where I first heard it and the other things that happened around the relationship I had with those people at that time. But because that album, that piece, it's really a piece. It's not a track, it's a piece of music. The visualization you're asking about, I think it also contains other aspects of my life that are connected to that music.
Right. So if we look at that that side as a concept and a concept album, or side two, Passage to Bangkok, how do you relate that as an experience to 2112? At least for me, Passage to Bangkok's always been very visual. Like, I'm on the road, and so what he's singing about, I was never a doper, but what he's singing about, right. I mean, I'm in that story, right. But it's a different story. See, it's a singular story.
Fly By Night was more that for me. Passage to Bangkok, quite honestly, for me, 2112 is largely one side.
Okay,
it's a one-sided album.
So are you actually saying there's a side two? Is that what, like, which is fair enough?
I'm saying that there is a side two when we didn't have time to go all the way through and play 2112.
Right.
Let's just play Fly By Night and we'll call it a night.
Okay.
Right? Those songs, of course, they're very visual. The imagery in them is very visual, but I didn't really want to play those songs. I wanted to play 2112 because I think that encountering that music also, it was a way for me to maybe not visualize. Maybe you could say it's a visualization. The intersection of different things that I was interested in, like that mentioned that symphonic aspect and that relationship with rock music, right? Whereas Fly By Night, Passage to Bangkok, they're songs.
Yeah.
2112 has tracks, but to me, it wasn't about songs. It was very different. So my visualization of the other side of 2112 is that it's those other songs.
Right.
But I have in Fly By Night. It was very much. I saw a lot of planes in my mind with that. And Passage to Bangkok has this really interesting kind of exoticism about it.
With that one musical motif as well, right?
So however you want to characterize the validity of that, and maybe whatever associative baggage that would be with that, how that would be looked upon now. At the time, it didn't have much a hook in me.
Yeah.
So the visual, let's just say that the visuals were a little bit more, they were a little, they weren't as deep. It wasn't embossed.
Yeah.
They're flat. 2112 was just very, very deep.
Right.
Really deep, like just carved in stone. You will love this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But and so that's the thing about encountering that music for the first time, was that this is possible. You could have a rock trio compose music that would compel people to sit back and listen to it. That was another visualization. Audiences sitting down and listening to rock music and taking in, which led me very quickly onto the whole world of progressive music, progressive rock, and the idea that people would sit down and listen to rock music like they listen to symphonic music. That was another visualization that, wow, that's great. I didn't know that people would do that. Yeah. So
That's cool. I just had to check the track listing because I couldn't even remember all the other tracks on the album.
this is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I think I played one of them. I think I played Something for Nothing before. But
Yeah, I've played all of them.
Yeah.
Something for Nothing, Fly By Night, Passage to Bangkok.
Well, Fly By Night's
No,
off
you're
of
right.
Fly By Night,
By
right?
Night, yeah, that's right. Big mistake there.
Yeah.
Wow, hand slap.
That's all right.
Yeah, see, I'd barely even know what's on the other, really.
Yeah, I'd have to look again, even though I just looked 30 seconds ago. I'd have to quickly look again. Like it's not it. Yeah, I liked them and I played them. I certainly listened to them, but I only in bands ever played Something for Nothing a little bit. Yeah, Twilight Zone.
Twilight Zone.
Yeah, Lessons, Tears.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So they just didn't make that impression on me. And
Yeah.
I'm okay with that, because the other side carved a huge impression in me. It actually, I would say, is also the if I ever was weighing the value of other Rush tunes, it would always be weighed to 2112, which
Right.
is not fair, really, because my first experience of that music, I don't know if it would have been the same with Moving Pictures, but it was 2112. And
Right.
that was my first introduction to Rush, but also a concept album.
With that same thought in mind, how much did that album then become a reference point for your exploration of or discovery of other concept albums? Like how, what was the, after 2112, you took a bite of the apple, right? You've got
There was this snake.
yeah, yeah.
It was there.
You went, so from there, what's the next album? Were you hungry for more concept albums, or were you just did you chew on that for a real long time?
I gobbled up. It was within a month that
Yeah.
I had, if I didn't own, I had access to the complete Rush canon at that point.
Okay.
And I had consumed it. And then within, I would say at least, a month of that, I was deep into Yes. I wore out Fragile twice on tape. Like, I love that album because it felt like the attitude of concept album. The attitude.
Yeah.
Right, which of course we're gonna get into that, but yeah, that opened the door to progressive rock,
Yeah.
but it also opened the door to, I want more concept albums. Where are they?
Yeah.
But definitely in the rock vein, and so Yes came up quickly, but then. Actually, the only album that I think officially is a concept album is Topographic Oceans.
Yeah.
So I found myself wanting to listen to things that were concept album like. And so what I thought that would be at the time, because of my instrumental compositional nature, long songs.
Long songs,
Long songs.
lots of
What? This
component
song is
parts.
5 minutes long? Please.
Yeah,
That's the beginning.
yeah.
I want at least 12. Yeah. That was the other thing about Yes that I liked too, was that they had a larger ensemble. So
Mm.
it echoed that orchestrational, symphonic, if you will, history, and not my relationship with it. But yeah, so I I was very much affixed to Rush and Yes. And Pink Floyd came in soon after that. But there was something about, especially Yes, not to get off track too much, but with Yes, there was something a lot more classically influenced that was apparent.
Mm.
They had people who were trained, Rick Wakeman, and, they had Bill Bruford, jazz drummer. Like, you had people who were trained in some classicism of music, whereas 2112 didn't come across that way to me. It was different, but I certainly saw it longer songs, long songs, and that was also why Iron Maiden was very quick after that, because they have some wonderful journeys
Right.
within not necessarily 12 minutes, but like my favorite is Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, because
Sure.
it does all of that for me. So that's really what it also set me upon, was compositional approaches in the rock world, and then pretty much anywhere else. But and then very quick after that too was then my love of movie soundtracks,
Mm.
because I associated the same attitude. Movie soundtrack is like a concept album, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But that's when it opened up for me.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot, a lot.
I like, I think we take note of the idea of time and journey, and sort of maybe the idea that a journey has to take time. Uh,
Mm,
Parallel to that, there's also the sort of existential Henri Bergson's idea of la durée, right? Which
yeah.
is this sort of experiential time
Hmm.
or existential time, which is detached from clock time,
Right.
but it still has that idea of journey and uh, and trying to escape the confines of
Mm,
clock time. So it's really about getting more time, as
yeah.
well. So that I definitely think within the experiential, whatever's happening with concept albums or those kinds of journeys, there is this need for time to
Hmm.
to escape the confines of time,
Hmm.
and whether it's by creating a very long song or
Hmm.
piece or album,
Hmm.
or opening up the existential sense of time and the experience of it. I think there's definitely something there
Hmm.
on the time element uh, that requires a little more.
Well, and as it was explained to me once, composition is the art of sculpting time with sound.
Hmm.
So I would agree with you,
Yeah.
very much so. And but what I found for me was that there was nothing to be done to get into that journey. I was just dropped into it. It's like the floor opened up beneath me and I went and I was happy. It was there's that thing about making time for something.
Hmm.
But what about when something overtakes you and you didn't know that you wanted it to and it did? What becomes time then?
Yeah.
Just the other day I was playing music, 2 hours, gone. Where did it go? Well, who cares? It doesn't really work that way, I think.
Yeah.
We just
Wow.
But the unhinging of time, when it's not, when you're not wanting to make it happen and it happens of its own and you love it and you don't care, it was worth it.
Right.
Time doesn't even enter into it. It's no currency. And so I think that's one of the things on a in a very, I think, metaphysical, philosophical way that I love about concept albums is that there's that no matter how well it does it for you, there's I think there's an attitude of, okay, let's begin. And then that's the last time marker.
Right.
We're going to begin. And then at some point it's going to end. And it might tell you that it's getting there, right? Like you might feel it coming.
Hmm.
Like Pink Floyd does so well on so many of their concept albums. It's coming. The end is coming. But you don't feel like you got to rush to get there. You don't feel like you want to hold it off because you actually want to hear how it gets there. So yeah, bringing up the issue of time, I think we're going to talk about that a lot. We're going to spend a lot of time, because I in my own life make a very clear distinction about what's experiential and what is not, what is constructed, and when it comes to music, even the creation of music, how long is this note going to be? When you don't have the regular formulas, you're not using the regular formulas as I do in a lot of my music of creating, of sculpting time with sound. The question of how long something will be changes. How long do I want this note to last? It's not, it's got to be 4 bars or 4 beats. It can do whatever it wants. And I think in the earliest stages is that was the other electrifying moment, is that you can do what you want. Because when you hear something you've never heard before, isn't that kind of what's happening? I've never heard this before. That means somebody went ahead and did something that no one else did in the midst of everyone doing what everyone else was doing.
Right. Because at that point, you understood a song is 3 to 5 minutes long.
Something like that,
You know,
yeah. But I
generally,
also
right?
had this symphonic attitude that a symphony is about 45 minutes, but it also has, either usually 4 movements, but, Beethoven, 5th movement, but that idea that there was still some structure.
Yeah.
But when you said you're writing a symphony, no one was going to be happy with 5 minutes.
No.
There was some expectation,
Yeah.
So even with the idea that we're going to do one side of the album, we got to fill one side of this album, that's another thing about concept albums that I'm always intrigued by, fascinated by, and I appreciate, is that you're signing up for that.
Mm.
You that vision does actually have to sit within a time marker. But the experience, how can you unhinge the markers for the person who's experiencing it,
Sure.
is another aspect to it.
So in 2112, we've got a side.
Yeah.
And we've got within that side, there is a structure to the narrative. And in contrast to songs that we see on the other side, the idea of a starting point and an ending point, and then a comparison to the symphonic form that has movements, we start to get to the question of album structure, and if 2112 had existed over 2 sides, what would that have looked like? Suddenly we would have a 2-act play or a two movement musical piece. Is that an intermission? Is it a pause? We know historically from a lot of concept albums that we're fans of. That's not enough. We got a double album. So now we've got 4 sides, right? And so now the structure of the narrative is more symphonic. It's got 4 movements. And are they natural pauses as you flip the record over? Is it an intermission? Is it I'm gonna have this consume this before I take my tea, and then I'm gonna have this after I take my tea? There's some really interesting things that that form and format start to shape or present or form what it is the concept album is. So going from that first experience with sort of a one-sided concept album, do full concept albums or double albums, like how do they stack up in your in your conception of them? Is the 22112, is there a difference there? Do you have an asterisk next to 2112 as a concept side? Is it incomplete in that sense, or
I don't think it's incomplete.
Okay.
I think that it having the effect it had on me, it already puts it in its own category no matter what.
Yeah.
I would say that, as I spoke of before about comparing it being comparison within Rush's other work, that was something that would happen now and then. Most often it would have been in those early years where cynicism was somehow fun at times. But I think that really it was an excitement of the format itself.
Okay.
So maybe if you had asked me this when I was 16, 17, maybe in my early 20s, I would have created some kind of hierarchy about that. But I think that through the weathers of time, it's not that. It's not about what a concept album is supposed to be. I think it's just the intentionality. It's the intentionality of committing to something like that. So if you say you're going to do, and now I think we're already stepping into the murky waters of what is a concept album, which we both know doesn't take very long to get to.
Yeah.
I think that because of my relationship with music composition and how I have a very wide palette, if someone was to say to me, I want to do a concept album, my answer will always be, that is fabulous. If someone said, I don't want to do a concept album, I would also say, that's fabulous too, because you know. And I think that the thing about concept album, that first experience with a concept album, was a knowing that wasn't intellectualized. It wasn't, I had a lot of hype built up around me, but my friends delivered bigger than they realized. But,
right.
But I think that I think that first experience, what I was tapping into was a sense of being, a sense of knowing that actually is somewhat separate from how we might usually characterize knowing as being understanding, a rationalized, whatever language you speak, based way of discerning experience. I was having an experience that was so free of those characterizations that has stayed with me. So just the idea, like just as when you proposed us doing this podcast, I was in that kitchen again.
Yeah.
The same feeling. And I think I would have had the same feeling if you said, I want to do a concept album. Or if you said, I want to do a concept album, would you play on it? I want to do a concept album, would you help me with, like, just the intentionality, the energy of that is what I think comes up for me most. So if it's two sides of an album, if it's two albums and it's all four sides,
Yeah.
and we live in a time now where you can write music that's 24 hours long,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no sides. It's just one thing. So the parameters of how to sculpt time, recorded time, has really shifted. So what I feel from your question that comes up for me is just the intention, the understanding, the knowing
Yeah.
of what to do. And I remember I was asked by someone I was studying with in university, Joel, when are you going to write your first opera? And I said, I never want to write an opera. And at the time, my impression of that other person is they were beside themselves. And again, my impression, my interpretation was that this is what all composers are supposed to strive for. They want in their canon is at least one opera, because it's the height of classicism in a compositional sense historically. And I said no. And that conversation ended. And I was glad about that because I didn't want to get into it. But if the question had been asked, when are you going to do your first concept album? My eyes would have glowed and I would have said, well, there's several.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have gone into that. But the interesting part is when I look back on that now is actually it's the same question. When are you going to devote yourself to a large scale work? Really simply.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, how a concept album is done, how it's done, why it's done, how long it is, those are all the variables, as some of the variables to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So for me, I think it's more the attitude.
So and intentionality,
Yeah.
and intentionality on the side of the creators, this sense of journey or progress through something. There's a starting point and an ending point, and so if you've got those two things, you've got a journey, journey in time. So the specific format of the album itself, beyond affording the opportunity for a certain, we'll call it blank time construct to fill in, is whether it's 20 minutes or 40 minutes or 60 minutes, it's still the same. It's still that journey. It'll have its unique format driven or structural differences from that. But there's we know it's not 2 minutes and 3 minutes and 5 minutes. It's got some minimum time requirement to be able to move through something and take you through something.
Which I've heard it said, and I agree with this. It's about being devoted to a particular theme, and that theme which is often what you find in progressive rock, for example, is more in the lyrics or the concept, and then musical material. Yeah. So if you have an idea, you have a theme, and you want to stretch it, and more than stretch it, which actually I think stretch might be more of a trap if you think about it that way.
Yeah.
So you want to make it a multi-dimensional, even a multifunctional expression instead of just doing a song about it, and then you tackle it from one angle, so that you are turning it like an object, and it's got many sides, or it has many facets, and so the duration, of course, this can be argued, how long is that supposed to be? But I agree with you that 3 minutes is not it.
Yeah.
It's not it. And I don't think 5 minutes is it either. 20 minutes? Yeah. Yeah. That question of, not experiential time, but measured time
Yeah.
is an interesting one.
I think maybe one of the things that one of the metrics that you can use to judge a concept album is its ability to, while you're listening to it, not be drawn to the specific of the timeline time of the clock time. I think that although clock time, there's sort of a minimum requirement, and there's a structural element that needs clock time happening. I think that if it can keep you in the experiential, that immersed experiential, then I think that's a merit that you can judge it on, like that success. I could name them, but there are albums for me that are concept albums that are 4 sides. Should have been 3. And they're 4 sides because they couldn't have been 3 because they had to fill 4, but they needed more than 2, right?
Right.
And so as you're experiencing these things, though, as you listen, there's I'm in, and then I'm looking at the clock. How long's this been? I don't know if this song needs to be here. Like, so I've dropped out of the experience in that moment.
Right.
Now whether that's because the songs aren't strong enough to keep me in the experience, or maybe I'm just not immersed enough, or maybe I've not put my seatbelt on or something. Maybe it was me after all. But I definitely that relationship between the experiential and clock time, and your awareness of those two timelines, I do think speaks to the success of the endeavor.
I think that's an interesting gauge. And like you said, should have been 3 sides, but it's 4. There's also that thing about how we experience things. It's like wine. It's your chemistry and the wine's chemistry that determines whether it works for you or not. It doesn't matter if it's a $20 bottle of wine or 200. That's what it comes down to. But the moving in and out of the experience it really resonates for me.
Yeah.
And I think that is a very fair marker for me to know, as I explained it, with Rush, I was so in it. I didn't want it to end.
You came out of the cave and you had mushrooms growing on you. Yes,
mushrooms. I had a long beard. It was 300 years later.
Yeah.
But I think that the other side of the time the other side of the experience of a concept album, which I think is what I was alluding to before when you asked about assessing concept albums
Mm.
against one another in one respect or another, is that what does it take for those individuals, their time and their focus to manifest it? So when I had said, if someone said, oh, I want to make a concept album, that would be the first thing that comes up for me, is their journey making that. So we have this idea of our journey of listening to it,
Yeah.
but then all the things that they will go through to manifest it. And for any of us who've read about how some of these albums have come to fruition, there's at least half a dozen moments where they seem to be completely based on chance or the aligning of forces that no one is really cognizant of, where something was made available that usually wouldn't be made available, or someone happened to show up that wasn't supposed to be there, right? There's this other aspect of the journey, which is of the creation of it.
Well, that's a fascinating point because you're right about that. Like I can't think of concept albums where the mythos of the creation, like the creation myth or the creation story behind the album isn't as celebrated or known as much as the album itself. We yeah, because I my when I think of 2112, I definitely know the story behind that album and how it was made, and and what point in their career it was, and
Yeah.
and all these competing forces that were looking to sort of close in on the band, and just what it took to create that, and what the risk was, and what the achievement was. Like that's part of my experience of that now. And Dark Side of the Moon, which we've spoken about before, we know a lot about that, and there's a lot of scholarship about that album and how it was recorded and how that music was developed.
Yeah.
And that carries through with a lot of stuff. So is the concept album itself, although of course it can exist on its own merits, seems to be really resistant to fully break away and deny its creators, deny its creation myth. Like that there seems to be a parallel story that wants to stay attached to the album, or to the experience of the album. So there's something sticky there.
Right. And I think that for me, how I would perceive another person saying they want to do a concept album is that it is an immersive journey. Just again, as if listening to a concept album that really draws you into its experience and keeps you there. That's what excites me about it too, is just the crafting of it, the manifestation of it. Because myself, that's where I focus a lot of my creative work, is on that scale. So I'm always excited and fascinated when I meet someone who is doing a concept album or something of some scale like that, that intentionality, because it is a very different journey than just writing a song. It's not less or more, it's different. And for me, which I think I project onto anyone else who would say that, is I'm also saying yes to things I don't have answers to.
Okay.
If just to give it give some kind of structure, if I, let's say, wanted to do a concept album and make it 45 minutes long, and that's my beginning, there's a lot of things I don't know. I don't know if I'll be able to do it. How am I going to do it? How is this going to play out? There's something about that sense of time, but also that intention that I think it carries with it some mysteries. And that's a part of the excitement.
Mm-hmm.
I want to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah.
I can see the entrance. I can see how it turns a little bit, but I don't know how deep it'll go. I don't know what'll be down there, and I don't know where I'll come out the other side. Right? So it's almost as though you're saying, I'm going to go through this tunnel. I hope it opens on the other side. Right? So that's the other part about it that I find really intriguing, because just as a concept album requires space and time, and perhaps even a certain view of listening to music or spending time, there's a whole bunch of other things like that that come up with the actual creation of them. I think you could call it a challenge, but I think it's also I think that for some people it's expanding their capacities.
Sure. So I'm following this here. Let me see if I can re-articulate something, or just
Yeah, sure.
articulate a little bit. So I was going to ask you the question that as a musician, because you have an awareness, and a composer, because you have an awareness of just the scope and the rigor, and the act of creating a long form piece like that would entail. Is this a uniquely musician's perspective on concept albums, on just that appreciation of the work, or is there something innate within the piece or within the album itself where you can't not but escape the rigor and the monumental endeavor of its creation? Like, is there something within the creative process that in sort of conscripts or transfers that weight or chewiness of all that effort, of those creation efforts, that they're apparent within the listening, not just to musicians? Is there something beyond that?
I don't think I have the answer to that,
Yeah.
because I can't tap into everyone's mind and everyone's experience. I think that I don't know. I don't know. I guess in a way you could say I am biased, because I am a musician and I am a composer, and I see things. I'm seeing it that way, or maybe it's just because I'm me.
Right.
I imagine if there was another composer here who was not me in any respect, they might have a completely different opinion about that, if I understand your question.
I think I'm not sure how profound the question is on its face. If I look at movies and I look at books, War and Peace. It's a huge book. Look how big that book is. It's as much. Boy, he must have really worked hard on that one. Sort of like everybody.
Okay.
Every reader picks that up and goes, "Oh, I know that somehow embodied in this is a monumental effort and a big epic movie has similar kind of like, oh boy, that that must have been a real..."
Well, and okay, so I think I understand a little bit more about your question. I think that when you take on something that we're describing as being big,
Yeah.
I think what you're actually saying is that nothing sits on its own. So the part of I think the intentionality of a concept album that I really love is that no matter where I am in it, I have to think about the whole thing all the time. I can't just say track 1, track 2, track 3. Just like I can't say short story, short story, short story. So there's something about, to use an analogy, it's kind of like, maybe like playing chess, where you're thinking X number of moves ahead and you have an understanding of X moves before, and they all inform one another. There's nothing you can do on a chessboard that doesn't inform the whole board all the time. So if people listening to a concept album or reading War and Peace say, wow, that's a huge undertaking, I can't argue with that, because it requires something of that person to do, or people to do that. And the first two things that come to mind right now, maybe there's more that we'll speak of later, is the first is it's that you're thinking about the whole thing all the time. Everything has to relate to everything else.
So somewhere in the moment of listening and experiencing and creating, you have you've got the two minds. Let's call it the creator mind and the listener mind, both aware of that. I'm in either an experience or a creation point where the whole is understood, or that you can, the embodiment of the whole, the totality of it is part of this sort of innate awareness moment to moment as you're experiencing it, both as a listener, but as a listener you're aware just by virtue, like in the same way that if when you pick up the book and it's 1,000 pages, and you're reading it, you're aware of that 1,000 pages and the totality of that.
But you didn't make any of those choices. I guess that's an obvious difference.
Right.
So the person who's creating it, they have to weigh and balance all of those elements all the time, whereas you are taking it in, right? It's you didn't cook the meal, but you're eating it.
Right, but you're communing with the chef.
There is still a communion.
Yeah. There is some sort of communion there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that I've had a number of people say that to me. I could never do that. Okay. But that's where I'm kind of left with, is okay. It's my natural inclination. So I think that whether people understand or know the nature of the undertaking in its details, I think a lot of people would say, yeah, that's a lot. They would just go with the amount of it or the scale of it and say, yeah, I could do that or I couldn't do that. But they assess it. I think maybe most people assess it that way.
Sure.
I think, yeah.
When we look at that 2112 journey, and we talk about there's the narrative, so there's a story being told. There's a philosophical sort of story behind, just like a concept behind just that narrative. Like so there's sort of the specifics of watching this visual narrative unfold, but then there's this sort of intellectual narrative that sort of holds it up and it's founded on. So we've got, in one sense, like maybe a physical narrative and then a metaphysical narrative. Conceptually, when you're thinking of concept albums, how some are very visual, some are very theatrical, and they're telling a very literal or picture-based story. Some seem to be much more conceptual or metaphysical. What are your thoughts on those two elements? Are they both necessary? Can you have one without the other?
Well, I think in the end, if someone says what they did as a concept album how can you really argue it if that's what they believe?
Yeah.
So I think that's where what a concept album is gets a little vague, and also becomes exciting because maybe someone will innovate in a way that other people would say, well, that's not a concept album. But time will tell that, yeah, it's a concept album. So I think that the simple definition of a concept album having a primary theme that runs throughout it, I think that is probably the most distinctive element I could say of it. Whether how that is just where it gets
Right. So the
open.
right. So theme may be suggestive of narrative, but narrative is subordinate or
Well,
to
I
theme.
think I think I think okay, so I think that there for it to run throughout,
Mm-hmm.
I guess by definition you're going to have a narrative.
Mm.
It's just going to, I guess it would be about arguing whether it works or not,
Yeah.
or if it's like, so for example, 2112 again, that overture, there's that musical structure of these things will happen later on and they'll be in a different context maybe, and they'll be fleshed out a little bit more. We haven't even hit lyrical content at all.
No.
We've only heard an overture, which classically is telling you what you're going to experience ahead of time. So I think that, but then I'm also the first one to say we cannot not have narrative. You know, we are so story based already, and the way we experience life, and a lot of the time, I think most of the time we conceive of it is as story. So to have a narrative, however you put that together, symphonies are musical narratives. And sometimes Beethoven's really long-winded about it. Right? It's like that fourth side. Yeah, I don't know if he needed that.
Yeah.
So, could you say that an album that goes for an hour and a half and is just a drone is a concept album? And what is its narrative? Yeah. So this is why we're doing this.
Yeah. Well,
Why
I
we're
mean,
having these conversations, because the question of even how a narrative works
right.
in a musical way, in a I mean, when the concept albums, if they do have a lyrical component, are they more a concept album than when they don't?
Right. So let's look at the question.
Wait a minute. I haven't even asked you the first time you heard a concept album. We're way deep in what concept albums are, and I still,
You know what?
I'm
Let's
biting.
roll back then.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm just biting to hear this.
Okay. Yeah. So rolling back before we get into deep waters. So for me, the first we'll call it adult concept album that I was aware of, and was actually the first adult album that was ever given to me. I was about 6 years old. One Christmas, I got a cassette tape, early days of cassette tapes, of Sgt. Pepper. And, you know, I knew of the Beatles, but I was young. Like, I was 6. I don't even know who gave it to me. It was back in those days. My family had big Christmases, often with some second cousins. So, you know, where there would be like 15 people in the house and, you know, 10 kids and what have you. But somehow I remember getting this tape, and I had the little tape recorder that we all sort of, you know, the realistic brand, you know, so you push the button, play. So I was, maybe 6 or 7, somewhere in there. And the only time and place I had to listen to it was nighttime when I was sleeping, because the house was full and we were sleeping in different rooms and not in our beds and stuff. And so I can distinctly remember being on the floor of my bedroom with my little tape recorder and a little set of headphones on. And I don't even recall if they were stereo headphones at this point, because I think they were like like headphones, but they could have also been like that mono earpiece kind of thing.
Right.
And so just Sergeant Pepper. Now, who was Sergeant Pepper? Not, that was for a 6 or 7 year old, that just the sort of structure, the conceit of that album, like this fictitious band. I mean, I only have the little album cover I could hardly see on the cassette to go by. And on the album cover, there's some vague reference to the Rolling Stones, like, because if I remember right, like on the big photo, there's a little like wreath and flower arrangement, and it says something welcomes the Rolling Stones.
Yeah.
And, so there's the Beatles and there's the Stones, but then there's the Sergeant Pepper, and just, putting those headphones on, and you hear the sort of orchestral tuning up, that's sort of happening before, so that places me immediately in some place, in some, like, in an audience getting ready to sort of listen to something. And that opening song, that Sergeant Pepper theme, kicking off and blending into the next song, where here comes Billy Shears. Don't know who this Billy guy is. He must be somebody, and just listening, and so my experience was sort of start to finish listening to that album, and trying to make sense of what it was. And so I just sort of initially followed the narrative as it unfolded before me. Oh, here's a band. Okay, they're playing. Oh, I think I hear an accordion. Like, it's like, what? And boom, this like amazing rock guitar, sort of sound on the opening theme.
Yeah.
And it must be a live concert, and they're introducing another guy on stage, and then it just kind of like goes into whimsy and goes into different people and personalities. Suddenly a guy's telling me a story about he's beating his woman, and like, what's this, like, and but he's getting better all the time, and now, okay, that's good. And then the benefit of Mr. Kite, that was that blew my mind.
Yeah.
That's where I stopped. That's where I was like, rewind, like, what is happening here? Like, what is this music? It's a carnival. Like, how do we go from, we're in a circus? Who's this Mr. Kite guy? What, like, how is this a song?
Yeah.
All these things, but, and I just played that whole album start to finish on my little cassette, and I had to flip the tape, and over probably about 3 weeks, because it was a long Christmas season, I played that tape over and over and over again at night. When I was a kid, I didn't sleep, right? I was so my nights from the time I was a small child were about reading or listening to the radio. And so it's no exaggeration to say, from 9:30 to 4 or 5 in the morning, I'd listen to that tape continuously over and over again. And I did that for about 3 weeks until my tape machine ate the tape.
Oh.
Right?
Oh boy.
Yeah. And that album was lost to me, right? So nobody replaced it.
Right.
It was gone, but I had this sort of like formative experience of this album, and trying to make sense of it in my head,
Yeah.
and taking it on as something adult, and having to sort of construct my own narrative for it and understanding of it, and all these crazy forms, that not only is it one of my sort of seminal albums, musically and adult consciousness, and it's this crazy sort of, it's this crazy bedrock experience of music and lucid dreaming and listening
Right.
at night, and like all these things that, and then it disappears for
Yeah.
4 or 5 years.
So, so at such a young age, though, you didn't have, like I did, I imagine, that, oh, this is a concept album.
No, I but within the construct of the album,
Yeah.
the concept was there, right? Like
Yes.
the concept
Impression
is the
was made.
impression of
Yeah,
this
made.
is a
Yeah.
band,
Yeah.
Sergeant Pepper.
Yeah.
And so okay, and I mean, for the Beatles, that's about as broad as their concept was. Oh, let's call ourselves something else and make an album that has a couple of
Yeah.
bookends, and but is everything else is kind of independent, except it runs together, right? Those songs, some of the songs run
Right.
together. So for me, through repeated listens, I just followed the concept as it unfolded,
Right.
and as I added meaning to it as a child listening. So I had to come up with explanations for who
Yeah.
these different voices were and
Yeah.
personalities were, and what a song like She's Leaving Home. I can remember just like weeping for this girl, this like who's leaving home,
Yeah.
and 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 trying to understand, like it did seem very natural within the presentation of all those songs, the way they all blended together,
Mm.
that 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 of course they would have to sing about her, like, and where she came from and how she came from.
Right.
These guys were, this Sergeant Pepper's band were sort of like otherworldly. They had like they had a knowledge of humanity, and were just presenting it to me, these in these
Mm.
stories, these adult stories.
So already at that age, you were able to take in that narrative, or that intentionality of the whole thing. It was the journey worked.
The journey absolutely worked. um I didn't know I was being taken on an artificial
Right.
journey, though.
Yeah.
I like, for me, it was like a real journey,
Yeah.
in the sense that, like there, like, yeah, I wasn't like, oh, that's clever. Like, I didn't have the awareness of some
Right.
guys putting this journey together as a piece of art.
Right.
It was the journey.
So how formative, you might have mentioned this a little bit, but just to point directly at this.
Sure.
So as I spoke about how formative it was for me and how important it was for me, how formative and important was that first experience of a concept album, and how does that relate to your later exploration of concept albums?
It, for me, it set me up to want to experience music in broader, longer time things. So I gravitated towards albums or bands or songs that had that kind of larger arc to the presentation. So I definitely, although I liked songs,
Mm-hmm.
I I I understood and was attracted to concept albums, and drawn to them more when I encountered them in the world.
Right.
They just felt more, not more important, but they felt more nourishing to me. They nourished me. They did nourish me more. Like I hungered for them. And so, what I did was as I became older, there were two albums that if you came of age at the end of the 70s, and as I became a sort of a preteen or teen at the end of the 70s, you've got the Grease soundtrack, motion picture soundtrack. You've got the Saturday Night Fever motion picture soundtrack. And something about both those albums, which were inescapable in that sort of like 1977 to 1979 time period, each in their own way a concept album, right? In the sense that they're both soundtracks. One's very specifically narrative, and the other one is just sort of thematically linked and the soundtrack to the film. Those spoke to me a lot, and I consumed them how I listened to music. I didn't listen to a single song. I would go and I'm listening to music. And so it would be, I'm closing the door to my room and listening to music meant an hour. It meant 2 hours, and I think one of the first albums, not the first, but the first albums I bought with my own money, when I was maybe around 10 or 11, was Sgt. Pepper. I went back and I bought, so I have my Sgt. Pepper vinyl. I think that, I think the first album I bought was Queen, The Game.
The Game.
In 1980 maybe, or whenever it came out. I was in grade 6 or 7. And right away I bought Sgt. Pepper, like almost on top of it. And sort of like going back to I knew I had to get that, and so I had that early experience with music being this larger piece to listen to, and this journey being more than just listening to a song, and then from that album, and then just the complexity of that and the richness of that as I got older. And I too was attracted to Rush. Rush was Moving Pictures was a big album for me, which as soon as I heard Moving Pictures, and I would argue in some ways, Moving Pictures to me feels like a concept album.
Yeah, I'm there with you on that too.
But for calling it a concept album, I almost never not listen to a full side. If I it just seems so right to put side 1 on and side 2 of Moving Pictures,
which is another interesting place for us to explore. Is that the need to finish the whole thing,
right?
And even though it's not intentionally designed to be that, although I guess most artists would argue, I want you to listen to the whole album.
Yeah.
Do you think that it being the Beatles plays an important role for you in your musical development? I think you've voiced, tell me if I'm wrong, that, and I did this too, is that I'm going to go listen to music. Like that was a thing to do.
Yeah.
So that value of music was very early on for you.
Right.
But that it being the Beatles, because as we've talked about, I actually heard Dark Side of the Moon before I heard 2112.
Right.
But I didn't know what to make of Dark Side of the Moon, so I just put it to the side.
You didn't have your spirit guide saying, come into my kitchen and listen.
Well, no, it was already out listening to 2112 before I did. It was picking it up for me.
Yeah.
But but when I got to 2112, there was something that clicked over, that the idea, the understanding of a concept album as that narrative or that journey was there. But Dark Side of the Moon, it wasn't there. I don't know why. But with for you with the Beatles, do you think that it laid any other groundwork for you around that?
I think the I think for me the musical complexity of that album,
Yeah.
and you know, there's the same things that there's sound effects, and there's cut ups, and there's like, you know, weird instrumentation, and you know, and there's songs that sort of relate, and but also songs that tell their own sort of narrative. I think it I'm gonna use the word kaleidoscope. There's a kaleidoscope to that album that I think activated or excited part of my brain and part of my imagination, that primed me to listen to and want to listen to music through that kaleidoscope construction. So when I listen to concept albums, or when I listen to Dark Side of the Moon, you know, which has less of a narrative, but equally has that sort of kaleidoscope, sort of psychedelia to it. My brain is twisting and creating and experiencing in the same way a kaleidoscope is when I listen to that. Right. And so a big part of that sort of like, I feel it, you know, it's like I feel the experience as much as I'm, you know, I'm kind of like visualizing something, but it's not always the visual narrative, although you know, some albums and some songs are, I mean, I saw the girl walking down the stairs, you know, to go into the kitchen and to leave the note on the fireplace. You know, I mean, that was very theatrical and very, you know, I saw all those things, but it was also very psychedelic. You know, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, you know, I equally saw that as something, you know, as I listened to it. And so it's, you know, narrative and visual narrative suddenly were untethered to, you know, they were immediately dreamlike. And again, because I probably listened to it sort of in a lucid dream state most of the time. And it's so I think I think it just primed certain receptors in my brain and in my musical self to just kind of look for things that would take me on those kinds of journeys. And those, and clock time was a big element of that, because you know, I was listening to music as a clock time sort of commitment, you know, or in my bed, you know, if I'm going to be awake for the next 7 hours, I don't want to be having, you know, to select 3-minute songs. Like, that's not how I'm going to listen to music. I'm going to have to put the radio on and just let it happen, or I'm going to have to, you know, so
there's that immersive understanding,
that immersive understanding of sort of getting in and surrendering to getting in the gondola almost. It's like, you know, like you know, it's like the carnival ride that pulls up on the river, and getting in the gondola and going on that river journey. And
because I as I mentioned before, I mean, I heard Dark Side of the Moon, but that concept album electric charge didn't happen but like you, I had that attitude of taking a journey with music. You know, I'd go to the record player. I'm going to listen to this symphony, or I'm going to listen to this Dave Brubeck album, or I'm going to listen to whatever else I was drawn to at the time. But the understanding of the concept album, I'm very intrigued about why it didn't happen then. I certainly don't stay up nights worrying about it, but I'm I wonder if there is something to be posed about why people would be attracted to that and why they wouldn't. And is it because of that's just how they don't listen to music?
You know,
Or is it something else?
For you, if I'm sort of like imagining myself as you at this point.
Oh, wow. Talk about a concept album.
Yeah. Part of what, what I think you experienced in that kitchen is what you described right at the beginning of our conversation. Like, you really identified.
Yeah.
You know, like you were immediately in that, and I think there was that theme and the way it pulled you physically and conceptually into the story, allowed you to identify with it. Well, Dark Side of the Moon is not written for, a 12-year-old, right, or a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old. Not to say that at 14 you can't jump into it and love it, but the apparentness of the concept and the theme, I think you needed to catch up to it, and also be primed to know how to recognize it. You might, and so like, it's kind of like, you have to prime the receptor to receive the information, like a vaccine, right? To date our conversation, like it's like, we're you gotta
Those
know
of you who don't know, it's 2021.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's all about spike proteins. But you need to sort of prime to be able to recognize. And I think, there's something thematically, and this may even be true in an aesthetic sense. I mean, one of the criticisms people levy against bands like Rush are that they're for kids, that they're, like, and I thought, and that's been sold as a reason to not like them, or to grow out of them. And I think, well, maybe it's just something very innate within their ability to connect to young people,
Right.
As their formative selves are developing and their awarenesses are developing, and that if you experience them at it during that time, you really are taken by it, and you're captured by it, and it becomes part of your evolution. And I think I think that doesn't make them juvenile. It doesn't make them, because it's like a kid's entertainer has to connect to children. That doesn't make him talentless, or he's got this innate ability to kind of find an audience and really make a significant connection. And until you've had, those kids grow up to be those adults that experience Dark Side of the Moon, right? So like, it's not one or the other. You need one to get to the other.
And that's a very insightful trip into myself.
Yeah.
Because as I said, it wasn't long after that album popped up again, and I was all over it.
You were primed. I
was ready for it, I guess you could put it that way. But I'm reflecting now on what you said about Sgt. Pepper's being like a carnival.
Yeah.
And then just how you said about, the ability to connect with youth, And so it brings me into thinking about the other thing that I love about concept albums, as I think it really taps into my playful nature. There's something really playful about. It's kind of like Lego, right? Here's all the pieces you have, but you know what? You can build a lot of things with the same pieces.
Right.
So, as I mentioned before, that idea of turning an object, looking at it different ways, the meaning, how and other ways to convey meaning. So, with thinking about like Pink Floyd, and maybe not being primed for it, is that maybe I can only conceive of at that time all those pieces maybe doing certain things, or a young person can conceive of that. But as you go along, oh no, you can do other things.
Right.
There's other shapes and functions that this thing can serve, and
Right.
you can pull out of it. And then there's that other part about concept albums, where the ones that stay with me, every time I go back to them, there's something new.
Right.
Like I don't listen to Dark Side of the Moon because actually I totally know what it is. I know that there's more in there that I'm not aware of, which I think is relates to us doing these podcasts and talking about concept albums, because we're going to revisit things we think we already know,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to invest ourselves in things that we haven't encountered yet. And
And that's the exciting part of the conversations, right? There's the predictable parts of the conversations that we will have imagined that we would have, and then there's those elements that kind of open up in here. And if there's a few things in every conversation that kind of come up and really sort of make me think, or make me want to dive back in, that's what makes me really excited about being able to talk about this stuff, because it is this ongoing dialogic, this ongoing experience and
an exploration.
Yeah.
And I think that there's something I found an interesting parallel the other day.
Okay.
Speaking of imagining what would happen in this conversation,
Sure.
and talking about the first time that my experience of a concept album was Rush, and I was in a kitchen, and I was sitting at a kitchen table, and how when we first talked about doing this podcast, I think it was me or you, I can't remember who it was, brought up the idea of it being like sitting at a kitchen table. So there's an interesting connect for me there. And
yeah, it was you that
okay. All right,
you that when we were talking about where and how, and and the idea, there was the practical suggestion of like where and how, and then there was the aesthetic sort of like, and it felt it felt right, it felt right. And but the fact that it connects both consciously and unconsciously to you, to a kitchen, and to that moment, the table.
Sorry.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, for my experience, the concept album to me is on the floor in the dark with headphones on.
Yeah.
Because that's how I experienced Sergeant Pepper for 3 weeks until my tape was eaten.
There's another meal.
Yeah, there we go. But at that kitchen table, that that's
with my mouth open.
Yeah.
In awe. Yeah. And I think that the dialogue, the conversations around concept albums, for me, with the spirit of not only talking about our personal experiences and our own insights or revelations, but just that it's celebratory.
Sure.
It's celebratory of the format. So even if there's a point, when there's probably lots of points where we can't agree or just really say what definitively is a concept album, there's a celebration of how they've occurred, and they are still happening. And we're actually in the midst of a revival of them. But one of the things that I know that I bring to these conversations every time is that electricity. Like
Yeah.
that, there's things I want to say, there's things I want to ask, but there's something really that I want to feel
Yeah.
and I want to express. And it's that feeling of that charge. And I think it's happened to me in a number of different ways in my life, for sure. But this celebratory aspect in a conversation is very important to me. And I think it's it will have its own surprises.
Sure.
And I think that it itself is in keeping with the idea of a concept album,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? Because we
I get
obviously
it.
yeah, so it's like that Sergeant Pepper's idea. We're going to talk about concept albums, but every episode is like a track. They won't elide into one another, literally as in a sonic event, but thematically, conceptually, they do.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I really like how focusing on the format enables us to go all kinds of different places.
Sure. Yeah. Because right now we've got so many open tangents we could jump into and follow. Like there's
Yeah,
so much. You talk about electricity, like
yeah,
trying to hold back the things you want to jump in and discuss.
yeah.
It's almost like we need to have a multi-track discussion simultaneously. Like
That sounds
yeah,
like a great concept album.
yeah, just going at once.
Yeah.
I getting back to sort of childhood stuff, one of the things, and particularly with symphony, when we talk about symphony, sort of as a concept album, I remember for me, as a kid, my records when I was young, like were storybook records, right? So, and Johnny Appleseed and Robin Hood and like these various Disney sort of storybook records that you would sort of see and read story and listen to songs. But one big one for me was the Captain Kangaroo, Peter and the Wolf album, right?
Interesting.
Yeah, and that album for me had one side was a narrator sort of narrating the story, interacting with the music,
Yeah.
and then the second side was no narrator required, but the same thing, but just the music. So like you were being taught how to hear the music as a story and how to visualize this story, and then now you got to just do it without the narrative. And I think about that, and I just wonder how much that primed me to sort of listen to music visually, and sort of to be part of constructing visual narrative
Yeah.
in music, and just how just that symphonic element to it, it's the story element. It was sort of really reified through visualization,
Right.
and the history of the symphonic element, sort of telling story so well, and then that being taught to me at such a young age, as taught to children.
That is really interesting. Yeah. I remember having a storybook with a tape for Peter Rabbit
Okay.
that I really loved, and the Briar Patch.
Yeah.
And that, like, the visuals of that are very strong in my mind. But what I think really primed me was my natural inclination. So I guess it wasn't really a priming, but the experience of this was I had my tape recorder,
Yeah.
but I would do, well, I didn't realize it at the time. I was doing radio plays on my own. So I would record myself and I do different characters and I sometimes record sounds outside and tried to do this, try to make something with this ability just to record sound. And I think that because we're talking about concept albums, like you were talking about how on one side there was the narration and the music, and the other side there's the music. There's this really interesting relationship with technology about it.
Mm.
We brought up the time issue, right?
Yeah.
2 albums, 1 album, both sides, and I think that the whole idea for me of being able to record my own voice and to play it back did something for me with sound that I'm still not. I sometimes reflect on it,
Mm.
what was going on there, because I've tried to remember what did I do, and what was I thinking when I was doing it, and why was I doing that, and that we're reflecting on childhood and that aspect of play, and I think that children love journeys.
Right.
They love being taken into some world. Like there's a boundary. There's a threshold that you cross. And now here you are. And then you'll be taken here and you'll be taken there and you'll be taken here and you'll be taken there. And so I found that when I think about this idea of making my own radio plays, it was like I was trying to make my own journeys without any idea of how to do it. Just go ahead and do it.
Right.
And and so in reflecting on that, when I think about how as I got older after that, I started to pull back and just maybe just that time when I encountered Pink Floyd, there was a pullback still happening, maybe a little bit. And when the rush happened, something let go.
Right.
Just
Okay.
a little bit, maybe more than I realize. And so I think actually in our conversations, we're probably going to get into some of that, the early influences of one's life. How do they cater to not only what you do, but how you receive, how you take in things, right? And that's a lot about what I think concept albums are for me
Right.
when we talk about them being a journey.
I when you talked about seeing sound as a creative thing, as a when you were making your own sort of radio plays up. Well, when you're a kid, someone gives you crayons, right? And so
Yeah.
you got this handful of crayons, and oh, crayons. I create.
Yeah.
I draw with crayons, right?
Yeah.
And so the tape recorder for you was a crayon,
Yeah.
and not every kid recognizes that, right? Or
Mm.
maybe, and back then, not every kid had a tape recorder that could
No,
record.
that's true.
But, so you took that and it became, it's a sonic version of a crayon, which is a creative instrument,
Right.
to draw a picture or to take a journey, right?
Yeah.
It's like plasticine or Play-Doh.
Mm.
That's what you did with it. And so I
Yeah.
think, did that mean that you were inherently aware of sound and process and creation and, had already created with sound, created with as a young person?
Yeah.
Is that part of your appreciation when you talked about of the auteur of the people creating the concept album? Like, is that
I
part of
think
your
so.
understanding
I
of
think that just, and when I had said that if someone said they really wanted to make a concept album or they didn't, I think that is actually out of my youth too. Of if you don't really want to, then don't.
Yeah.
That playful aspect is just there, and you follow it. Yeah, yeah.
Did you have a Peter and the Wolf? Did you experience that at some point?
Well, I did experience Peter and the Wolf. Actually, though, if you talk about that that realm of music, what it really was the Nutcracker. The Nutcracker. I love the Nutcracker, which and Tchaikovsky is often written off as not the greatest of composers. I don't listen to that. I'm very content with my feelings about the Nutcracker. It's great. It's really good. And I still this day remember getting so excited when the Rat King came out. And then there was the cannon.
Nice.
The cannon's gonna fire. The cannon's gonna fire. Yeah. But yeah, Peter and the Wolf, for sure. I mean,
Yeah.
that was in the record rack somewhere
Yeah.
at some point. Yeah. But it was definitely the Nutcracker. It was every Christmas, still to this day.
Really?
I will listen to the Nutcracker, and sometimes I'll play some of it on the piano a little bit. And
Have you ever attended one of the performances?
up aside from that one when I was a kid,
Yeah.
I think I've gone to one other performance of the ballet.
Yeah.
And I've been meaning to maybe take a couple of people someday
Yeah.
to that. But yeah, that was more for me than Peter and the Wolf. That one really stands out. Peter and the Wolf was there, but it wasn't the same as the Nutcracker.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's very hard for me not to go to that moment in your kitchen, and sort of like, following that as its journey. If we were making the concept album of the concept album podcast,
That's where it would start.
that kitchen journey would be what the song, one of the songs, second song, kitchen journey after the overture. Yeah. The getting primed.
Well, maybe that's a good place to leave it
Yeah.
for sure.
I learned a lot, and as I think we've spoken about before, as these sort of conversations come to their natural end,
Yeah.
part of ending them is because I'm still excited about everything that this is going to make me think about as I leave. So it's like I want to hurry up and end this so I can start thinking about it. It's there's lots. I'm again appreciative of being able to sit at the table with you and talk about this stuff. And
Yeah. And knowing that at 6 years old, you were right in the hot seat of Sergeant Pepper is something that I'm going to be reflecting on, and I'm very intrigued about the conversations to come out of where we've started.
yeah, I thank you. Yeah, I as I am as well. And I sometimes wonder about when my tape recorder ate that tape, because that I was rewinding and all the things that happen, and having a tape getting eaten was not an uncommon
No.
thing. But it was, I think, the first time I ever had a tape get eaten, and it was a horrific sort of loss. But it gave also Sergeant Pepper this sort of like sacred artifact, lost to time element for me. So it, even though it was gone, you would hear it mentioned, or you'd hear the Beatles mentioned as as I was getting older, and I had this sort of like it was the Ark of the Covenant in the warehouse, lost to time, lost to building its own mythology in me. So I wonder what would have my experience been had that tape not gotten eaten. Would I have gotten tired of it? You know, would I've like outgrown it, and whatever that meant for me, you know, like would I've moved on from it? But the fact that it kind of got gobbled up kept it sort of frozen in time, and it became very mythic to me.
Well, I think that I've tried to save many tapes from the digestive tract of my tape recorders. So I feel that.
Yeah.
And I don't know about you, but I always had a pencil right next to my tape player. And that was what it was for. It wasn't for writing. It was for rescuing tapes.
I got good at it later on. I think at 6, it was my, first encounter. And there was no, in fact, it was probably salvageable, but for how I, the panic
Pulled
and
it out.
pulling it and, tape everywhere is like, what have I done? So, good times.
Wow.
Sweet. Good conversation, man. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.